experience. Notice any places experience. Noticing where there's ease. Feel the vibration of the space inside you, around you. Observe any images as they come and go. Notice any and all feelings, welcoming them all into the space. Observing your thoughts as they come and go. Notice any action urges. Any ways your body wants to move. And as you think about the sermon, think about any words or feelings or vibes that stand out to you. Any ways in which you felt moved or triggered. Ways in which it affirmed what you already think and feel, and ways in which you're not quite sure if you believe in that. Maybe take a moment to set an intention for our time together, maybe a way that you'd like to show up or be present. And when you're ready, taking a look around and taking in all of these different beings in the space. So when I wrote this book last summer, actually what happened was it was my first summer working at a university full time. And I had a lot of downtime and I thought, what am I going to do with my summer? And I thought, I'm going to write a book, which, hence my sermon, how can I do less? And it was really that I had spent years doing anti-racism workshops, like multiple days a week. And I thought, I have all this knowledge in my head, and I don't do as many workshops as I used to. And how can I reach more people in a topic that I think is really, really important? And the trick was, how do I say out loud, or how do I say in writing things I usually say in a workshop? Because I want it to be meditative, I want it to be spiritual, I want it to be embodied. And I want to find the dance between it being palatable to people and it challenging people. And I also felt like I was about to turn a corner, and I wanted to capture the way that I think right there in that moment before I turned the corner. So that's what came up for you during the sermon today. I think it's a book in many ways. Was better? Yes. Awesome. Great. Oh, great. Thank you, Reverend. All right. So, anyone want to share what came up for you in the sermon today? Yes. I heard you say about the liberation slogans.
And in the book, it was a way to practice mindfulness of what's happening in my body when I hear the different slogans and how it changes, and notice what's happening in my body. That was a really great access point to marry mindful race talk with mindfulness, because I never would have connected the two, but it is a lot of what we experience is in our body. So, and how a certain slogan brought up tightness, resistance, discomfort in me. So, that I really like that.
Yeah. Because I think if we can notice that tightness, then likely it's going to impact our relationship, right? If I feel tight and I project that onto you, then it's going to be really hard for me to be curious about anything you have to say. Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else? Yeah, Ted.
One element of the sermon that was particularly new to me, or at least challenging for me to think about, is the connection between the struggle in Gaza and anti-racism and justice work that many of us have been doing. And that connection, taking it away from simply a political opinion to a moral and justice related one, is critical. I want to shout out about the readings, though, that preceded the sermon. Many of them just knocked me over. I have to work on them and think about them a lot.
From Hospicing Modernity. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree about the readings. I need to reread them, and I'm looking forward to the discussion sessions later. So one thing just that struck me was when you said your friend asked you, are you Malcolm or are you Martin? And even for me, like I was thinking, well, okay, yeah, like, even as a white woman, well, but just thinking of that, like what, how to move forward and what, and I like the way you described like young or old, and also that both people were working toward the same, just in a different way. And one other thing I thought of when Mary Beth spoke was when I heard you say, okay, these are all liberation slogans and make America great again. I thought of it from the perspective of how would I make America great again? And so I pictured like this wonderful America. And it was, just a different, a different way of a different context or whatever, which made me realize that, the words themselves aren't bad.
Right.
It's just, who speaks them. And you talked about that some too, who speaks them and what they're getting at. So,
Right. Yeah. And I think that for me, thinking of when I hear people say "Make America Great Again," or even if I see it in various places, it helps me soften to think this is your liberation slogan, right? And so then I'm curious about what is your Make America Great Again? Because I never get to hear people talk about what are they actually looking to happen. And I think that shuts down a lot of conversations, is we're not maybe asking, what do you mean by that? Because maybe I would buy into some aspect of it and we could build a bridge.
One of the things that stuck in my mind is the conversation you had with the gentleman in the supermarket, where he said the freedom is in your mind.
Yeah.
And I think that's so true, because a lot of times we don't state our opinions because, or maybe that affects your thinking too, but freedom really begins in the mind. That's what stuck with me.
Yeah. And it makes me think often, like in the last couple of months when I've been a little bit more scared, and I just keep telling myself, like, how do I find safety inside of myself? Right? Because the world is going to continue to be the way the world is, but how can I find steadiness inside of myself? Which to me is so much of the practice of mindfulness, is finding steadiness, finding that equanimity. Yeah.
So there were many things that struck me throughout the sermon. So thank you for sharing. But one of the things that I think stayed with me a little bit was your move, because I also moved, but I did the reverse. So
Been there, done that.
yeah. So my children and my family, we were in a very diverse community when they were small. And their father was insistent that we move. So we moved to a town that is, they're one of the only, right? And so it's really rough for them, especially my son. My daughter is much more a people person, a more social in the being. So she found an easier time, and she was younger. So he was older. He was a high school freshman. So he had a harder time adjusting. And I found myself doing all the things of like, just ride your bike, but just don't wear that hoodie, and just all that preparing him. And it was really, really rough. And he had a mental breakdown. And he had to go into Princeton house, and it was really, really hard for him. Yeah. So it was really, really bad decision for a lot of reasons. But the reason that we ended up going into that town was because it is one of the top school districts in New Jersey, right? And so because of the way in which we fund schools, you follow public schools. So if you're going to go into the public school system to have a decent education, you follow that. And so, and at the same time, children of color who struggle, especially if you're neurodivergent, struggle because they then feel othered and in a lot of ways, right? And so it just was really hard for him. So that was the piece of the sermon that really just kind of held heavy for me, because it was just hit home in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add to that. We've lived in 3 different school districts. We first lived in Hamilton, and what we noticed in Hamilton, our kids have always been in public schools. What we noticed in Hamilton is when we moved to Hamilton, it was racially diverse, at least the part of Hamilton we lived in. And then as the kids went up in grades, we saw the white flight. So when kindergarten, it was I would say 50-50 maybe, or something like 60-40, like the typical census demographics. And then as they went up, you saw the white kids left. And so then it became okay, but we outgrew our house anyway. So we were okay, let's move to Pennington, which I always said I would never live in Pennington. But it had many charms, and it's closer to Washington Crossing and blah, blah, blah. And we were only there for 3 years. And then I think the mixture of the racial reckoning of 2020 plus doing anti-racism workshops almost every day, I just felt I can remember at Kwanzaa, the end of 2020, saying, I don't think I can stay here. And you're talking about the school district, right? We have 2 neurodivergent kids, and it was the pandemic, and it just felt like our oldest was struggling so much. He was in 7th grade at that time. And what's so radical is when we moved to Ewing, and I had to work through all of my biases, right? Because who moves from a white, wealthy, one of the top school districts in New Jersey to one that is viewed the opposite? And so I had to evaluate how much of this is class, how much of this is race, how much of this is what stories you've been told about what happens in Ewing or Trenton or whatever. And that it's a trade-off, right? To be Black and middle class or upper middle class, you have to choose if you're going to go with race or if you're going to go with class. And if you decide to go with race, meaning more people who look like you, then you're automatically going to go to towns that have less resources. And so we experienced like the, the trade-offs of that, right? So I would say, while I think it was the best decision we could make, and our kids have been thriving as a result, and I really could see the trajectory of they wouldn't have thrived in that other place for many reasons. But I also think that whiteness and white supremacy is so ingrained in systems and in cultures that even when the people are really nice, it doesn't change some of the biases and the ways in which the system is created. And I just thought, I don't have the energy to do all the other things, like make sure they go to an after school program that has like lots of Black people. I'm not going to leave UCWC so that they can go to church with so it was like, well, how can I counter all the anti-Blackness? Like if I believe in HBCUs, like historically Black colleges, why don't I do it earlier? Like give them a chance to like love Blackness, even if they're biracial, let them love Blackness, which I would say they have. And they see the diversity of Blackness, which they never would have seen if we had stayed in Pennington. Yeah.
What stood out for me in the sermon was actually when you mentioned the Black Panthers.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of grew up when the Black Panthers were active. And I remember feeling fear, and because that's the way it was presented to us. And
Mm-hmm.
I was listening to you recite their 10
points.
goal to 10
Yeah.
points, and I thought, wow, that
Mhm.
is not something to be afraid of.
No.
So it really struck
Yeah.
home with me.
Yeah. And it makes me think of the way systems work and who gets to control the media, right? Because who are we afraid of now, right? Who are we taught to be afraid of now? And it's the same, I mean, that's how kind of white settler colonialism works, right? Is that you pick different groups of people for the masses to be afraid of, and then you dehumanize them and delegitimize them.
I was moved, pardon the pun, about moving also, because last night I went to see the documentary, which was selected as the winner of the Academy Awards. And the name is No Other Land. The people have nowhere to go. It's about the Palestinians. And I was thinking of these options that we have. We have choices. They have no choice except to be subjugated, really.
Mm-hmm. Or to leave their homeland. Yeah.
Well, not even the homeland, leave their town to lose.
Like they can go to a different country. Like, I mean, yeah.
So, or even a few miles away would mean that they would lose everything.
Mm-hmm.
But I recommend that people possibly see that movie and think about how our choices are. They even plowed down the elementary school, which the women built it during the day and the men built at night, did the real work at night. So, so we have choices in education too.
It's a great documentary. It's about the West Bank, and it was filmed over 5 years before 2023, so 5 years before that. And I saw it in an independent theater, I guess like a month ago, but it's one of those documentaries, even though it won, it didn't have distribution in the United States. So it'd be very difficult. Like I had to go to Philly to see it. That's great. Yeah.
I don't know what extent you may have covered this in your book, but do you see any connection between the race talk and religion? Do you see like any correspondence or sort of parallelism to the extent religion is a part of the race talk?
Can you say a little bit more when you say religion?
I mean, structured, organized religion, particularly orthodoxy, structures of religion, institutions of religion.
Yeah, I don't think I talk about it too much in my book. I think I talk about the wheel of power and privilege. And so kind of focusing on more how Christianity is kind of the privileged or the default, and like everybody else is kind of othered. But I don't really talk about it too much because I feel like it's such a big topic with so many different religions and so many of them like ethno-religiously connected. I feel like that would be a whole other book. Important topic, I think, for sure. Not my book, but somebody else's book for sure. That would be great.
I just wanted to get another quick point. Another good or feature is called Distant Strangers. Came on Netflix recently. It won the Academy Awards in 2021 for a short film category. Distant Neighbors. We watched it last night. Yeah, it was fantastic.
What is it about, or who is it
It's
about?
about a Black man in New York City. I think New York City, right? He goes through this repeated, almost like a Groundhog Day. Each time he tries to do something, he gets shot, and he comes back, and then he does something slightly different. He still gets shot. So it was a very moving movie. It's only 32 minutes long.
Wow.
I think you could watch that and maybe update.
Yeah. I love how we have so much more representation in art and media, which allows us to be able to metabolize stuff in a different way. I think it's powerful.
One thing that struck also was you're mentioning the Black Panthers. When you listen to a number of their principles, these are economic justice and the intertwined nature of economic inequality and racism. When you made a choice to move to Ewing, because of a long history of housing, et cetera, in our country, it should be that you'd be able to move a community that might have a diversity you preferred, that did not involve an entirely different economic structure in the area. But in the United States, that's what comes in most parts. And that was one of the Black Panthers. You're hearing their demand for economic justice, and they've been intertwined now, maybe inseparably. And I thought that was another reminder.
Yeah. And I think when we think about structural racism, how do we think about how racism morphs over time? So if you're only used to looking at racism in one way, then you might miss how it's morphed, right? So you address one policy issue, but because you don't address the root cause, then it morphs into a new issue, right? So we don't have redlining anymore officially, but yet if we were to look at many towns, you would think it's still redlining, right? It's just called something different. We have fancier words for it. I'm always struck when I read stuff that says we were the most racially integrated, like living wise, in 1988. And we've been more segregated ever since, right? If we think of New Jersey, it's the 8th most segregated state in the country, right? Probably one of the most liberal states, but also the 8th most segregated. And I think it's 6th most segregated in terms of schools. So just thinking about like what's happening and what's the legacy of stuff that happened in New Jersey that creates that inequality, and what are the lawsuits happening that are trying to demand more equity and more justice and more access to that your education shouldn't be driven by your income, right? And who's pushing back in those communities saying, I don't want affordable housing, or I don't want whatever, right? It's just racism in a different way. And I think what's hard, particularly I think in predominantly white spaces, is do you think you or your kids miss out on anything by being in predominantly white spaces, right? I think like that's the question, right? Like I was thinking that, oh, my kids are going to miss out if they're not around a lot of other Black people, right? And I wonder if like, do white people think that? Like, oh, my kids are going to miss out if I'm not around a lot of other white people. I'm going to miss out if I'm not around a lot of other white people. Yes, most white people think that, right? Hence the way that they organize their life. And I think like that's the part of like, how do we do that inner work, of like, maybe I like living in this town, but how do I also keep building authentic relationships with people across different ethnicities and thinking my life is better because of it. Like my kids could find relationships with white people. That'd be easy. They're the majority. But how do they get those relationships with other people in a way that's deep?
One of the other things that struck me or that stood out because of the career that I've had was when you talked about health and what I'm going to call health. Shows up in our body and our growth. Because not only education and economics are one of 9 social determinants of health. And in the research, it shows that African Americans who are born and from US are much more likely to die early with lots of health and issues due to racism. Not because of any other thing. And that immigrants, so I'm not for them, and so 4 generations in, it's second generation, so they're third, 4 generations in, they match. Okay. So when my parents came, they don't match their health, etc. 4 generations in, we're going to match the population because of the racism. So when
Bill Neely, audio. Oh, here comes audio down here.
Mm-hmm.
Can you actually hear anything?
No, I can't.
There's research to show that that Black bodies and 4 generations.
Yeah, I'll add that there's this phenomenon they call weathering, which is looking at particularly Black and brown bodies, but all minoritized bodies, and just the level of stress that you experience in a lifetime that like reduces, the quality of your life and like the length of your life. But even thinking about the research that they do around, like, we know that there's a high rate of pregnancy-related deaths, particularly for Black women, that even when you control for class, it's still at the highest levels. And what they find is that Black women who have babies younger, let's say like as teenagers, have a higher chance of survival than as they age. So even if like a 15-year-old versus a 25-year-old, it's already, because you have 10 extra years of weathering, right? Like that worsen your outcomes. So thinking of, part of what I talk about in my book is my mother, who passed away in 2017 from cancer. And I'm so clear that being a Black woman weathered her, right? And I think about those last couple of years of her life, because she was like very clear. She was a nurse, and she was very clear, like, I want to wait till I'm like reach the retirement age. Like I want to, and I remember those last 2 years were really hard for her. Her body was saying, stop. But she was just like, I want to hit this number. And then 2 years after she retired, she died. And so thinking also, which, in some ways was helpful to me because it helped me like reorient. Okay, what are all the ways I weather my body? Like not just what society does to me, but what are the things that I do, the ways I participate in the system in a way that will shorten my lifespan? And how do I begin to change that? Oh, I mean, so much stuff. Oh, she asked, what did I find when I did the self-review? Um, I mean, I feel like every year there's something new. So, I mean, I think one was deciding to move. So like, I think I'm someone who changes pretty rapidly, but I also think I'm someone who, I think because of that, I'm more willing to do things that would historically have scared me and maybe stopped me. So like when I was like December 2020, I was like, I think we should move, even though we've only been here like 2 years. And then, 8 months later, we had moved, right? So I think it's just like, I'm like, oh, I'm not happy with this job anymore. I'm going to move, right? Or like, oh, I'm too stressed from being fully self-employed all the time. I'm going to switch. Like, so I just think of like, I noticed the stress on my nervous system more. I might have noticed it before, but I might not have done things to adjust. Like, oh, this kind of workout, that doesn't work for me anymore. Like, or
Mhm.
like, oh, diet culture, breaking up with that. So I think it's just more seeing like all the ways I can divest from the system, but I can't do it all at once. So let me like chip away, and like over a couple of years, then now it feels well integrated. But I still notice it. I still like the fact that I wrote a book last summer because I was like, kind of bored. What else am I doing? Right? It's like I'm gonna really try this summer to just like do nothing, go to more Pilates classes, do nothing. So check in on me, see if I'm going to more Pilates classes this summer. Yeah.
I'd be okay if they would wrap this up. I have a question, but I don't think I could ask it in this format.
Give it a try.
Green light, red. So my family members here for 30 years. And my first husband died in 2003, and memorial service was here, and his name is on the wall of remembrance outside. So I just kind of dropped in today to say hello to you all. And I live in England, where, let me see, there are no guns. There's nobody who's called an orange orangutan. And there's free health care for everybody of every color. It doesn't matter. However, we have really, really, as you know from your history class, we have really deep-rooted prejudices against Black people. I mean, England was so complicit in the slave trade. Anyhow, I just want to let you know that this is a perfect place for me to be right now. Thank you.
Yeah, when you were talking about how much your kids learn from, Black culture and being in a Black neighborhood, I was thinking about how, and, what happens with white people. So when I moved to Princeton and, was living in the white bubble, I didn't realize how much I was missing. And then gradually, through some anti-racism work here and so on, I started realizing like all the Black literature, Black culture, Black people, it was just like, oh, what have I missed for, like, I don't know, 70 years of life, whatever that. So, and other people talk about this a lot. I'm sure that, just the interaction, the opening your eyes is, an
Well, I heard that
Hello? Oh, hello? There you go. Okay.
Well, just that, I said, oh, I'm surprised to hear the Princeton High School is so racist. And this Black woman said to me, well, of course, you're white. And I just kind of went, oh, yeah, you know. So, yeah, I mean, it's true, like you say, the neighborhood makes such a difference, and that to break out of the bubble takes an effort, and that I admire your bravery in just saying, I'm going to move and move. So way to go.
Yeah, thanks. Well, it makes me think about how do we begin to ask the question instead of, is there racism in this town or in this congregation or in this whatever, this book club, whatever it is, but more about how does it show up? And then also thinking about like, what does it mean to decenter whiteness, right? Because I think some of what I struggle with, I'm listening to this book that's comparing Martin and Malcolm, which had been in my library, but I hadn't until my friend asked me Martin or Malcolm, and I was like, let me dig deeper into this. But I think this idea that integration often means assimilation into whiteness, right? And so even when the neighborhood gets a little bit more diverse, if it doesn't cross a certain amount of numbers, then it's usually, racially minoritized people assimilating into whiteness, meaning like they're bringing a version of themselves, but it's usually for the white gaze. And so like part of white exploration is, how do I co-create a space where people are not just taking care of me? Because I often think of Ken Hardy, and I think I talk about it in the book.
Which really well.
I think I was working at Princeton University. It was like 2015, 2016. He came to do like a professional development workshop all day. And he's a Black psychologist, talks a lot about racial trauma. And I remember at the time, the counseling center was like a third people of the global majority and like 2/3 white, which was like the most racially diverse place I had ever worked in. And I remember he turned to the white therapist and said, do you ever think about the ways in which people of color take care of you? And there was silence. And then he turned to the people of color and said, tell me about the ways in which you take care of white people. And I remember being like blown away because I was like, nobody ever asked me that. I never thought about it. And I was like, I do it all the time because I'm usually in predominantly white spaces. And my parents taught me well, like how to be one of those non-threatening space like people. So it's interesting to try to live into a body that's more disruptive when that's not how I was taught to be. And that the world treats you differently when you are more disruptive.
Mhm.
And how white people supposed to the path for people to take care of.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think one thing is I always like a good marker to me is like, if white bodies flinch when I say white people, right?
Mhm.
Like that's a good marker of like, okay, have you done that level of work where it's not like a slur, it's just like white people. It's like Black people, white people, so.
I didn't really understand.
And I think this idea of bodies, right? The more time you spend with certain bodies, the more your body gets used to it, right? So if you're used to only being with other white bodies or mostly white bodies, then you just haven't even built the repetitions, right? The 3,000 repetitions for embodiment. Yeah, somatic practitioners say it takes like 300 repetitions to build muscle memory. It takes 3,000 repetitions for it to be embodied. So that like the vibe you give off or the like your comfort level, like that it's automatic, right? So I think about like some people, who were getting to know me like after the backlash and they were, I was trying to process it out loud and they were like, you were so nonviolent in your response, even though you were feeling such trauma. But that's because the embodiment was there because I've been practicing for over a decade, right? And so that when you're under stress, right? It's kind of like when you're under stress, where do you go to? If it's not a habit, if you haven't built the reps, you're going to go back to lizard brain versus like, right? It's like You're going to default to the isms unless it's well integrated.
Let me just say that what Natalie's talking about now, very well developed in the book.
Thanks, Ed.
Read the book.
I wanted to share maybe some of my experience with finding a school for my kid. We were part of the first cohort in New York City when they were rolling out the lottery system for middle school. And by that time, we were already doing a lot of inner work and doing a lot of anti-racist work. I believed firmly that my kid would benefit from being in a very diverse classroom. And still, when we learned how this was going to roll out, we were just terrified. And it took a lot of unpacking what that meant to be able to sit and be okay with it. It took a lot of just hours of talking about it and trying to unpack that with others. And it's disheartening because I don't know how to help people do that work if they're not already willing to come to this conversation. It's a lot to ask of people, but it's also something that we can't not do. And so I just really wanted to share that, like, even when you believe in the fight, even when you want to make a difference, actually doing the thing is incredibly hard and scary and difficult.
Agreed. I think that part of the work, I think in part 2, I talk about the anti-racism continuum. And I think that a lot of what my experience is that a lot of white people are in that not racist, sometimes ally category, and that it takes a lot to move into accomplice and co-conspirator, right? Because I think when you're an ally, you probably have attitudes that are about integration or equity. But then there's like a point where you decide, oh, this is too much, or I'm too exhausted, it's too scary, the risk is too great. And to move to accomplice is, I think about what are you willing to lose or risk for the greater good, right? And so that's why in my sermon, I was talking about, even when it felt really crappy, I had to remember I'm trying to be an accomplice to Palestinians. And whatever they're experiencing has got to be worse than what I'm experiencing, right? And so when we think about whatever we're trying to be an accomplice to, right, is the targeted group is always experiencing it worse than our protected self. And that doesn't mean we don't have marginalized identities that make us more vulnerable, right? And so thinking about how do we move theory to action, right? So like, what's the thing I'm willing to do that maybe brings me out of my comfort zone, that takes a little more risk, that maybe is a little more inconvenient. I love that my kids were here today. They're 15 and 17. And I love that our 15-year-old daughter, who like loves Amazon, that over the last month or so has like learned to like that automatic thing of let me go to the Amazon app. She's like, oh, let me see where else they're selling the stuff, right? And so I'm like, yay, 15 years old, yes. So just thinking about like, how can we plant the seed for also the next generation of like, yes, it's more convenient to do it on Amazon, but it doesn't support our values. So let's go to it for what we need. Like, let's support independent authors, or let's whatever it is, but let's not do the thing because it's just convenient. Let's figure out like somebody else, hopefully locally owned business where we can go. It might take you longer to get it, but it's like, how do we begin to like those little inconveniences? And then maybe eventually we can do the thing that maybe will get us some hate because it's something greater.
Thanks. Yeah.
But I hear you saying right now to talk about it. Is this better?
Yes.
Yes.
You're talking about choosing, like from a place of consciousness, how to be. And in your book, as well as today, you mentioned two resources for me, and that is like the wisdom of the body, like, oh, my stomach is turning. Why is that? And the power, so like I see it as your superpower of, you said it, of staying curious. Like, so how as a practice can I every day, like where the rubber meets the road, like listen to what isn't consciously being expressed and get conscious, present to that, hold the discomfort, be curious about it. And then to me, that's how consciousness expands, and then choose how to be, how to shop less on Amazon, not use plastics, you know, one day a week, maybe.
Right.
And do the work in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And just like, how do we bring mindfulness to daily life? Yeah. And then, yeah, respond versus react.
Hi. I have a
You have a friend.
Hi. I have a friend who is called Black, but she doesn't want to be called Black or even African. She could hear it.
I mean, I think that's part of the building literacy, fluency, and agility, right? Is figuring out what is affirming to people and not assuming what it is. Like, I imagine people read her as Black, but I guess if we're in relationship, I would want to find out what would be more affirming. Maybe it's not being race at all. Like, I ran a workshop the other day, and someone who I would perceive as being of the Asian diaspora introduced themselves as like a global citizen. And I was like, gotcha, global citizen. And so how do we, you know, I think about pronouns, I think about race, ethnicity, religion, like how do we take the time to figure out what people are, knowing that our brain likes to put people into boxes. Yeah. And honor who they are. Yeah. Yeah, being curious. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
If one of us is not free, none of us are free. And that's everything that I know.
Yeah. Yeah, I wish that more people believe that. Yeah. I would love for us to move away from the binary that, like, in order for some people to feel safe, other people have to not feel safe. Yeah.
I spent a good part of my childhood in Mississippi. My dad was in the Navy, so we were back and forth. And I saw, because I had lived in an area that wasn't actively, where racism wasn't spoken, because it was largely all white. But when I went back to Mississippi, it was so startling. But one of the things that I take away was just how it was the first class of Black children in the high school that I started in the 10th grade. And just the distortion in people's lives by hating other people. I mean, I saw it in the way people ignored the other Black students, except for the exceptional football player and the exceptional music artist. And I also saw it in just what happened to the white people, the kids. And I mean, it's horrible both ways. I mean, yes, there's privilege, there's safety, but it's such a broken way of looking at the world. So yeah, I loved what was part of the yeah, yeah. I thought that was really important.
The people who say that oppression hurts the ones being oppressed as well as the oppressor. I think they each lose part of their humanity. And so how do we, whenever we're thinking about dehumanizing another, that's part of the system. Even when I hear on my feed,
particularly white liberals who are unhappy with the current administration and are pointing the finger at those who voted for the current administration, like even that is part of the system, right? Because and I imagine, 4 years ago, it was the reverse, right? And so this idea of even if I don't get it, like how there is so much of this population who felt that the last 4 years were so horrible for them, right? And so it's not 2% of the people believing that. It's like 45%. I mean, it's a large percentage of the population. And so how do we get curious about this polarity? How are people living in the same country but having a totally different experience? And how did they experience shame or dehumanization or even maybe accountability felt too traumatic for them because maybe they're not used to being accountable. Maybe they're not used to, equity, like for whatever it is, how do we become curious? Because I personally would love to talk to more people who are conservative, but they're not in my circle. So they don't show up to my workshops. So believe that they don't show up to my anti-racism workshops.
Okay. This is more of a, I guess you'd consider it scientific comment on the racist divide. And that is racism is embedded in science, not only in its practices, but in some of its terminology. For example, white noise refers to noise which is irregular in time and frequency. So it's pan-frequency noise. There's nothing white about it per se, but we consider it harmless, so we call it white noise. If you said black noise, what would you think about? You'd think maybe about a bunch of people who don't think like you, who are making their opinions known. No, couldn't be, right? The other term is black body in physics is black body radiator. It was thought at one time that objects which were black absorbed all energy coming in on them and radiated all energy from them in a particular way that's described scientifically. But in fact, it's not the case that in all cases, a black object we see as black is radiating more energy than a white object. You can have paints which are specific for radiating energy. And they do that on buildings, for example, to paint the roof so that it radiates energy. You're not absorbing lots of energy in desert climates when you don't want to be. So there's another instance of something in which we're using a term that probably isn't the best thing to use to pejoratively or innocuously pejoratively, one thinks,
actually
to describe.
Black is absorbed. So black body.
Yeah, I've tried to talk to some of my conservative neighbors that have signs up at the head of the block, and says, well, what about this and this and this? Oh, you don't know anything. You don't know anything. I don't want to talk to you. You know absolutely nothing. That goes into her house. So people are set aside in a reality bubble that's been generated by Fox News over the last 10 years. And they are thoroughly cut adrift of the reality that the rest of us consider, even portions of it.
one of the last things I talk about in the book is the movable middle, right? That
Mushy middle, we call
that
it.
if we look at the spectrum of political ideology, that most people aren't on the wings, right? Like I would say I'm on the left wing, right? And part of what you're describing is people on the right wing, that most people are the exhausted majority. So they're anywhere from moderates to politically disengaged to like liberals and different kinds of liberals, like more conservative liberals and more or traditional liberals. So I think about how I'm usually not trying to change the people on the right wing. I'm trying to change everybody else, right? And so in my mind, if I let go of that, which is like, I don't know, 20 something percent is like the wing, but everybody else I think is movable if they have conversation, if they have curiosity, if they're humanized. So I guess I try to let go of the people who are in a totally different hemisphere and everybody else who, if they came to our workshop, if they read a different book, if listened to a different podcast, if they built a relationship, right? I heard this, and I mean, I encourage people to like find the good stuff that's happening now. Like I heard about in Montana, you know, they had like all these bills or like anti-trans bills, and like there were people there, the representative was trans and like gave a moving speech, and like they were able to not pass this anti-trans bill, right? So like this idea of like people can change, right? But if we put them into a box like, oh, let's discard you because you think you're over there. But I wonder if humanity, like wanting good things, like I'm sure most of us concerns about the economy, right? Maybe our ways of solving that problem are different. And so how do we hold space for you might have a totally different understanding of like how we solve this problem, which is different than you hate me and my people. And like how do we spend enough time with people to figure out which one are you?
Yeah, along the lines of trying to talk to people. So
I'm not sure how long this is
my
gonna
brother
go.
is a Trump supporter, and it's easier when it's someone in your
But
family
I
because you
think that
can,
I'm
you know, sometimes you
done.
can talk to them.
I'm done for
And,
as
you know,
well.
what I find is
It's too
by
hard.
asking questions,
Get
you know,
big
well,
here.
like, what do you think about RFK?
Yes.
Because he's a doctor, and like, how could he support him? What does he think about vaccines? And he started going on about how we should never have had a COVID vaccine. And I described New York City for him
What she said.
in the early
Mhm.
years. And I said, well, you can say that it was, you know, harmful, but let me tell you, da, da, da. And then the more we talked, the more he was kind of like, well, okay, okay, you know. So he still thought we shouldn't
What
have
happened?
boosters, but at least he
I
could
had it.
see, you know, that,
I
well,
can't go on.
so
Oh, I guess
again,
I had a
it's
headache.
easier because he's my
Yeah,
brother,
right.
but my sister just yells at him and you
Thanks.
know, like, okay, you voted for Trump, you're an idiot. And so again, I think that, you know, like you're saying, trying to find common ground, trying to, you know, well, just ask, like, what do you think? Or why, you know, why do you support this particular thing? You know, sometimes it works, sometimes, like you said, people may just walk away from you or say, well, you're an idiot or whatever. But, you know, I think as many people do, you know, like you're just saying, try to, you know, find the middle ground, try to talk, try to ask why. What are you afraid of? Because I think fear is so much of what drives people.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I guess I'll leave you because I want to be mindful of time with just, even if you don't have the bandwidth to like talk to people about their political opinions, maybe just treat them really well, like love them and wish them well. Because like maybe even that versus like you're disposable and like disgust, like maybe that will at least humanize us so that we can have political differences, but still like create a good world together.
Thank you.